Hello and welcome to Bread and Rosaries, the Christian left podcast that might just repent and return to Rome now that George Galloway says that we should. I'm Ben Molyneux Hetherington. I'm joined by Adam Spears. Say hi, Adam.
Hi.
And we're joined by William Gibson. Hello, William.
Hello, good to see you.
Have you both seen George Galloway saying that the one true church is the Catholic Church?
Yeah,
I have not seen this. No.
So I don't know I don't know if this is like an old thing or what, but apparently George Galloway is like a hardline Catholic, and yeah, he basically tweeted in relation, I think, to the war in Iran, basically saying the one true church, as represented by the Pope, is attempting to stop the war. And anyway, I thought, you know, as a fellow Scottish leftist, George Galloway would make you feel more at home if we started talking about him at the start.
Well, I mean, even the king becomes Presbyterian north of the border. Come on, like we're all Presbyterian up here.
The what?
The king.
Sorry, this is a rule on this podcast. He has to be called by his name, not his title.
Okay.
It's an Adam rule, to be very clear. Everyone else refers to the king. Like,
Charlie boy.
Charlie, yeah. Do you know what's interesting about the George Galloway thing, though? Is that for some years there's been like speculation that he converted to Islam because like people can't really work out that someone would be sort of, I mean, for all his faults, okay?
Yeah.
But like people can't work out why someone might be supportive of like Muslim communities if they are not themselves a Muslim convert, you know?
Yeah. It was in relation to all the stuff about, which we talked about on our Iran Mind Crates recently, that all the stuff around the kind of reading of Revelation and stuff to American troops, and about, you know, American Protestantism and all that, and him basically saying, well, of course, he says, there's only one church founded by St. Peter, one holy Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church. Its leaders, the Pope, is daily working for peace. The others are working for war, and more war. So I didn't know that every other single church, apart from the Catholic Church, is pro-war, but possibly news to some of them.
I think it's always the case with anyone who's claiming that their church is the one true church, is that actually, if you look at their documentation on ecumenical relationships, that their leadership and their own church are light years ahead in the conversation of recognizing that actually there's a lot more that we have in common. Just this week, I was at a service that was a renewal of baptismal vows, which was a liturgy agreed by the Church of Scotland and the Roman Catholic Church in Scotland in 2006. We have a shared liturgy that we can do together that is sacramental, as a celebration of baptism, and was at the World Council of Churches last month. And similarly, you just hear about all the great work that's going on between churches, and then you go online and it's just a dumpster fire. So it's totally different.
I mean, look, not a small amount of which is probably promulgated by this podcast.
So, with our chat about George Galloway aside, we should probably introduce you to listeners of the podcast, William. So, would you like to just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so my name is William Gibson. I am a student minister in the Church of Scotland. I'm in my second year training for ministry. So the full fancy title is a candidate for full-time ministry of word and sacrament. And basically that means is that at the end of this process, I will, if everything is successful and all goes well, I will be a parish minister. That's still a while off. So I'll have 3 years training in total, and then a year and a bit probationary period as well. But alongside my training for ministry, I'm also doing a PhD at the University of Glasgow. So I'm researching the Church of Scotland in the 1960s, in part because my undergraduate dissertation was on George MacLeod, the founder of the Iona community in the 1960s, and how his theology of the incarnation impacted his campaigning on nuclear disarmament, which is a very niche topic, but I loved it. But then I discovered that actually there was so much that needed to be looked at in a little bit more detail in the 1960s. There's just so much going on at the time, and I thought I would love to write about this and research some more. So I've spent most of my first year in the archives of the General Assembly, learning about what was going on at the time, getting some more details, and there's some excellent stuff in there that is fascinating, and potentially also relevant to maybe some of the conversation we'll have today, because I did have to go back to the 1920s to look at some documents there too, which relate to some of the social setting around like Red Clydeside and things like that, and the economic environment there. But yeah, that's the two main things that I'm doing. I am an Iona community member. I was hallowed as a full member last year, but I've been an associate for years before that. I used to work at Apple, and I was part of unionizing the store in Glasgow. So we became the first unionized Apple store in the UK with a collective bargaining agreement. I was part of the negotiations and things for that, which was super fun. Well, at the time it was very, very stressful, but
Yeah.
when we got the end result that we wanted, it was great. And then I left Apple and worked for the Student Christian Movement for a year as their theology and resources project worker. And then after that, started my training for ministry. So that was a bit all over the place. I probably could have been chronological there, but gives you a sense of what I'm doing now, and then maybe just some of the things that I've done before too.
And to throw a cheeky plug in, you can actually read more about William and his work unionising Apple in one of the recent issues of Shibboleth magazine, which we are big fans of around these parts. So, a very interesting article talking about some of the experiences of doing that in there as well. So thank you very much, William. That's really fascinating. For those of you that have tuned into the podcast hoping that we are interviewing fantasy author William Gibson, I'm very sorry. Like, there is no I don't know, is he? I know of William
next
Gibson.
week. That's
Yeah.
week.
I don't know if he's, because everything fantasy these days is horny as well. I don't know if he's like, was it romantasy where it's romance and fantasy? I don't know if he's that or not, but either way, if you're expecting fantasy novels, it's not what we're doing this time.
I've got to say, Ben, I for a moment there, I had no idea where you were going with that. I thought you were going to ask. You started going on about how horny things were and like aiming it at William. I was like, I might be out at this point.
Yeah.
I just assume all of the fantasy authors that I like, newer ones that I've heard of, are doing that romantasy stuff now. That seems to be the current trend. So that was all that was.
Either that or dystopian. There's a lot of dystopian writing going about just now. Some good, some not so good. But Prophet Song, great dystopian novel if you've not read it. Paul Lynch. Yeah, it's Paul Lynch. I've got it on my shelf up there. Prophet Song by Paul Lynch. Excellent dystopian novel.
Oh, very good. Do you know what? It's been on my like maybe I'll read that list for a while, so I'll bump it up the list. So there's the book recommendation, not horny fantasy, but dystopian fiction.
You would be amazed the amount of times that on different social media sites I get tagged as in a post about William Gibson's novels. So part of me is like, do I just change my name everywhere? But then it's been the same for so long that I cannot be bothered doing that.
You just have to become famous enough that you're the William Gibson now. Like, you have to out-popular him. I
mean, I doubt the theology side of things is ever going to be as popular as, what is he considered, like the father of modern sci-fi?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
So, let us move on to the first part of our podcast today. And we start, as always, with what else is on my mind, Grapes.
What else is on my mind, Grapes?
And Adam, I believe you have something on your mind, Grapes.
Yeah, it's been interesting. It's last week. It was 8 years since Anna Campbell was murdered by the Turkish state when she was fighting for the YPJ in northern Syria. And I live in Bristol, where she lived before she went out to volunteer. And a lot of the people that I kind of am gradually getting to know, because I haven't been in Bristol very long, a lot of them knew Anna. And so there's been a bit of buzz around, honouring her legacy and who she was and that kind of thing. And it's just really got me thinking a lot about her and about how we respond, particularly at this time as well, when there's increased violence. We're seeing obviously what's happening to Iran, and then also in Syria, things are still not great in Syria, particularly with Rojava and what the new-ish Syrian regime is doing to them. And it's one of those things, as someone who's always been very, very certainly anti-militarist and sort of to varying degrees pacifist, but also really respects the sacrifices of people like Anna Campbell and people who fought in revolutionary Spain as well. It's just been a very, very, the last sort of week or so, I've been thinking an awful lot about how we respond to that kind of aggression, that kind of violence. And I have no real answers to that, but it's just been something that I think has been on my mind, Grapes, for the last week.
Just for people who don't know, just give us a brief précis of who Anna Campbell was.
Yeah, so Anna Campbell was, she was a anarchist, anti-prison activist and plumber who lived in Bristol. She wasn't from Bristol originally, but she lived in Bristol, and very, very involved in all kinds of things locally. And she went off to fight against ISIS with the YPJ, which is the kind of women's section of the democratic forces in northern Syria. So kind of what you might describe as a sort of libertarian, socialist, anarchist kind of adjacent grouping. And she was very, very interested in the writings of Abdullah Öcalan, who was imprisoned by the Turkish state decades ago at this point. And yeah, Anna Campbell answered that call for people to come and fight ISIS. And she paid for it not by being killed by ISIS, but by being killed by Turkey when Turkey, you might remember, Trump withdrew American troops along the border between Syria and Turkey. And Turkey immediately invaded and killed a lot of these democratic fighters because they were predominantly Kurdish people. And there's, the Kurdish people and the Turkish state and the Syrian state and various states have had difficult relations for a long time, because when the Western powers were carving up that part of the world, they basically forgot about the Kurdish people. And so they ended up sort of chopped up into different states. So anyway, that's sort of a whistle-stop tour of who Anna was and what she did and why she did it.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It does raise these questions of, I guess, both those questions of what does it mean to oppose violence in a more complicated way, but also, I guess, on a more personal level, the question of like, what commitment do we have, or do I have as an individual? When you look at these people who go and fight abroad for a project they have no immediate connection to, right? That is quite a confronting thing when I think about, what am I doing in my life when you look at people doing this stuff. It asks questions of yourself about what our responsibilities are to act.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I really have been thinking about a lot this week in particular. I'm very lucky in a sense to live in a city that has a very, very active kind of radical presence of various kinds. And I think this week I wanted to do something. So there are regular. There's I live near a prison, and there are regular sort of noise protests, kind of protests of solidarity, because there's one prisoner in that prison in particular who is one of the Bryce Norton Five, so accused of going to a RAF base. And remember when they went in and basically sprayed planes with paint and so on. So one of the guys who did that is imprisoned near where I am. And there was just something today, this week, I think, that felt, I don't know, it felt important to be part of that for some reason.
Yeah, I kind of get that. Doing that small amount that you can is, I don't know. I guess we can get caught up in thinking, am I doing enough? But doing something is quite an important thing as well, like that. Following that sense of call to do something about this stuff, right?
One of the things that I really appreciate about the Iona community is the recognition that not everyone can do it all, and that we all play our part in working towards justice and peace. So they have a thing called common concern networks. So they have ones that are focused on peace and disarmament. They have ones on race. They have ones on LGBTQ plus inclusion, on poverty, on the environment, on Palestine. And so recognizing that members get involved in each of these different groups and carry a bit of the burden, even when you as an individual cannot focus on all of the different things that are going on in the world, even when you cannot act in every way, or you're limited by circumstance to what you can do as a community, they're doing so much more. And I suppose it's part of maybe the vision of what the church is supposed to be as well, is that actually together as the body of Christ, so to speak, that we should be working for justice and peace, the kingdom of God that is justice, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit, that actually when we're doing our little bit, it contributes to that bigger whole. So,
And there's something to be said for the idea of, I think there are forms of church I know that I've been part of where, like, if you're committed to seeing out the kingdom of God as envisioned by that church, you can do something with that church every night of the week. Do you know what I mean? Like, and actually, there's something about having a space to say, actually, if you're committed to seeing a vision of the kingdom of God come about, then actually that we can kind of network and use that, but it's outward facing. It's not that kind of internal stuff, right? That is, it's not about saying, well, if you come to church every night this week, you'll be able to really get involved. But about saying, actually, we can network together as a church to kind of go out into the world and do stuff. And even if that stuff is not, entirely church related, it is still kind of part of that calling, I guess, if that makes sense.
Well, and it is church related, isn't it? Really, when it gets down to when we start thinking about what church is and should be, as William kind of said a moment ago, there's an argument to be made that stuff that really is church. That is what church is about and should be about. I think there's something we can learn in the UK in particular. Well, certainly churches, some, by no means all, some churches in the US, and obviously, historically in particular, churches in kind of Latin America as well, with liberation theology and that kind of thing, where, those churches were unafraid to act politically in ways that I think we are basically terrified to even start thinking about, start contemplating in this country, which is not to say that churches don't ever talk about politics here, but I think they talk about it in a very, very muted and establishment kind of way. Yeah. Whereas actually, a lot of churches elsewhere, you've got churches, particularly when say, for example, the Black Lives Matter things were happening, where churches were being used as distribution centers and places to look after people when they've been attacked by the police and that kind of thing. Like, another thing that's been happening here in Bristol is the anniversary of the kind of riots that happened in Bristol, I think 5 years ago, if I remember rightly. And what we saw on the news with that was that, people in Bristol are rioting, they're attacking police and so on. The word on the ground is very, very different here. The word on the ground is not that people attacked the police, it's that the police attacked the people. The police attacked the people and the people fought back, and now people are in prison because they defended themselves. And that's a very, very different picture. And I do wonder whether, churches could have perhaps played a more helpful role in that. I don't know. I wasn't there at the time, but I do think that's something that churches need to kind of, in this country, I think we need to stand up and make ourselves counted.
Have you read the book All Riches Come from Injustice by Stephen Morrison?
No, I haven't, but he's someone who's on my list of who I want to get on the podcast. So I'm hoping to read that.
Yeah, it's very good. And when you go through it, you just see how strong a lot of the language was in the first 5 or 6 centuries of the church against those who hoarded wealth. It would refer to people who hoarded wealth as murderers, because they are taking something that is of common possession and making it private, and by doing so they are a thief, they are robbing. And if they have the ability to feed someone who is starving and don't, then they are in part responsible for their death. The language that they use is so strong. Even big figures that you maybe wouldn't expect, like Augustine, for example, writes really strongly against the rich. John Chrysostom is like one of the strongest, I'd say, on it. But the quote that is the title of his book is from Jerome, and it's something along the lines of, "All riches come from injustice, because either you can only gain wealth by unjust means or by being the son of an unjust person," something along those lines. So you gain it by inheritance, basically. But I think when you look at that, he puts forward a case for the church being much more explicitly anti-capitalist. And last year, I got to go to the General Council of the World Communion of Reformed Churches, which that represents about 100 million Christians globally from a good number of different Reformed denominations. I couldn't tell you the number off the top of my head just now, but it was interesting, the conversations that you have there, how anti-capitalism just seems to be part of Christian witness in so many other places but then you raise it with people, with Christians from Europe, and there's a bit of people begin to feel a little bit uncomfortable. They squirm in their seat a little, but then you speak to anyone from basically anywhere else who are seeing the direct consequences of a global capitalist system where climate change is causing their island that they live on to be submerged underwater, where they are seeing the impact of kind of imperialist wars in their own country with their own friends and family. And so actually, I think there's so much more that we could be doing. And a lot of us, I say a lot of us, a lot of the church in the West is very comfortable just doing charity rather than the work of justice. And with the thing that comes across in Stephen's book really well is that actually to redistribute wealth as justice, whereas just giving for a moment is charity, and that the church should be committed to charity. I think it's as Sam says, that God's throne is established on justice. The foundation of it is justice and righteousness. So there's all those ideas that you can connect, that one of the signs of God's rule and reign is justice, and it can only exist where there's fair distribution of the common goods of all the earth.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always incredible to go back and read some of those patristic thinkers, because yeah, you're right, like fairly consistently. I think maybe the most, well, I suppose what we might call kind of milquetoast they get is to kind of say, like one or two of them might say, well, if you are rich, then you have to make sure that you're looking after those who aren't. But like, that's the very, very, like, most of them are like, yeah, it's wrong, it's bad, it's a crime, as you say, it's murder. It's incredible stuff. But yeah, I'm really interested in, you know, what you were saying about the going to the World Council of Churches, and was it World Council of Reformed Churches?
Yeah, I've done both recently. Last year was the General Council for the World Communion of Reformed Churches, and then I was on a study trip in Switzerland. When was it? Last month, and we visited the World Council of Churches for a day then too.
Yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it, how easy it is for people who, and let's face it, like churches, particularly white churches in the global north, are, you know, very, you know, notwithstanding, you know, what we might say about a classist, a Marxist analysis of class, churches are very kind of middle class institutions, right? In the global north, particularly white churches, and so it's no wonder that people in them kind of squirm and feel a bit uncomfortable about talking about and criticizing capitalism. But that's not what the church was ever really meant to be. Like, the church is meant to be of the poor, by the poor, for the poor. And I think the fact that it kind of no longer is in the global north has to be connected fairly clearly to the decline of churches in the global north, the numbers of people attending going down. I think if people, I'm not necessarily that wedded to the idea of like church growth, to be honest, but if the people who are wedded to that idea want to know a reason why that might be happening, I think I might point in the direction of, well, what are you actually saying about the stuff that really matters?
That's one of the theories on secularization. I think it's Grace Davies writes about it, talking about this decline of association, basically, where it's not just churches that are seeing this alienation and breaking down into just the individual as the primary unit of society. She basically says that you see this disaffiliation from trade unions, from community organizations, from your local allotments and other places that you'd be usually going to and forming communal bonds and working together on things and getting to know your neighbor a bit more. And that's part of this bigger picture of individualism. And actually, there's some of the reports from the Church of Scotland towards the end of World War One that are looking at this question of like, what do we do after the war, and also looking at some of the housing situation that's going on at the time and why people aren't going to church. And they come back and basically say that one of the biggest factors is to do with social deprivation and poverty. And so they begin to talk about these ideas of reconstruction during World War, and then they're kind of abandoned after that, which is a shame. But a lot of that's because the government changed direction on it post-war.
You've mentioned World War One there, so I'm gonna pull on that thread because we're going to go back in time a little bit today to that sort of time, because we've invited you on, William, in part to talk to us a little bit about Red Clydeside. This is part of our effort. We claim to be a UK-based podcast, and so we do like to acknowledge occasionally that Wales and Scotland do in fact exist, and that there are things happening there as well.
We won't talk about occupied Ireland, right?
Well, I think. Do you know what? I don't know if you remember this. We made a very specific decision that we would describe ourselves as UK-based, not because we don't want to talk about Ireland, but because we were like, we're not making any claims about our understanding of Ireland, but also about, we're not a Great British and Northern Ireland, is
but
overly complicated.
But UK implies Northern Ireland, right? Because the full name is UK and Northern Ireland.
Yeah, you're right. Do you know it's the longest country name in the world?
Yeah, I did. Yeah,
that's fun. Well, it would be a fun fact if you didn't already know it. So that's anyway. Leaving aside my inability to understand the geography of and naming of this country, we are going to talk a little bit about Red Clydeside. So, William, I guess that we'll start with a really basic question of what is Red Clydeside?
Yeah, so if you were to dilute it down to the most simple answer I could give is that it's an era of political radicalism from roughly the early 1910s to towards the early 1930s. There's a lot that's going on at the time. So Glasgow was the second city of the empire, with the River Clyde allowing the growth of its shipbuilding industry and the transporting of goods across the British Empire. So you had lots of stuff coming in and out of Glasgow, all facilitated by the Clyde, which is why it's called Clydeside. So that involved Glasgow. It involved other towns like Gurk and Greenock and Clydebank, amongst other places too. Govan would be a big name there with some of its shipbuilding that was going on at the time. But Yeah, compared to the rest of the UK, Clydeside was actually relatively slow in its political organising and trade union activity compared to the rest of the UK in the late 1800s, because you had the new unionism appear in the 1880s and this kind of boom of socialist movements, of trade unionism. But between 1890 and 1910, trade union membership trebled while wages had fallen by an average of 10%. So this was in Clydeside. But this led to, because of this disparity in wages, of conditions that weren't getting any better, and this increase in membership, it led to what is called the Great Unrest. There was also a similar thing happening across the UK in the early 1910s. So this was just prior to World War One. So there was a significant increase in industrial action, trade union organising. Over 100,000 new trade union members joined a union affiliated with the Scottish Trade Union Council between 1909 and 1914. So one of the most notable strikes was at the Singer Sewing Factory in Clydebank. So a third of the workforce were women, and they'd not seen pay increase with profits. The company were anti-union, but the workers organised anyway. So a group of women down tools, and then within a couple of days, over 11,000 workers were out on strike. The strike was defeated, at least in part, because of inexperience. But trade union activity and membership continued to increase in Scotland at the time, and especially around the kind of Glasgow and Clydeside areas. And across Britain the following year, actually, they saw, so this was, I think, 1912, they saw 14 million strike days. This is across the UK, and all that was going on in Glasgow and the surrounding areas was a big contributor to that. Yep. But yeah, that continued on into 1913 until the outbreak of war in 1914, where what was going on began to take a different shape in terms of the political radicalism. But maybe I'll pause there and we can talk a wee bit about that first part of just the trade union activity and what was going on, because it shifts during the war to being more of a kind of anti-war, and also rent strikes too during it.
I just hear you talk about this huge explosion of growth in union and strike days. I think, Lord, I've seen what you've done for others, and I want you to do it for us. Like that is, yeah. If only we were blessed with such powerful unionism in this time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm wondering if yous came across much on Red Clydeside before. Have you read much on it, or
only a tiny amount? This is not, and only because quite a while ago, actually, Adam said we should do an episode on it at some point. And
okay,
cool. I that's the first time I'd heard of it. It was probably 18 months or so ago, because that's how organised we are. But yeah,
okay, cool.
Yeah, but it is not something I am hugely familiar with at all.
So yeah, we'll go straight into the war then, and some of what begins to happen once war breaks out. So in 1914, World War I breaks out, and the Great Unrest came to an end, and this idea of socialist internationalism was really shattered by total war. You had people who were self-professed socialists fighting against one another on the front. It is then in the anti-war movement that we begin to see some of the major names associated with Red Clydeside really emerge. So John Maclean, for example, who was a Marxist organizer and educator. And then there's also Helen Crawfurd and the Women's Peace Crusade. So we can, I know that we're maybe going to talk a bit more about Helen later on, so I'll skip on just now.
I'm assuming John Maclean, this was prior to Nakatomi Plaza, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, you gotta make
that's
sure.
That's such a stupid joke, Adam. So what's even worse about that? What's even worse, Adam?
Is that I did it the other day?
Yeah, you made the same joke to the other day. That's a
pre-prepared
joke. Ben. That's a pre-written joke, believe it or not.
The fact that it's been used more than once is surprising.
Yeah. And once was more than it should have been used.
But so yeah, this period of time also saw rent strikes, for example, in Govan in 1915, where tenants refused to pay increased rents and staged mass demonstrations against evictions, which resulted in violent confrontations. But one of the most notable events of Red Clydeside was actually after the war. It's sometimes referred to as Bloody Friday, Black Friday. It's also known as the Battle of George Square. So in January 1919, a 40-hour strike was called to support the demand for a shorter working week to cut unemployment. They were also trying to prevent the removal of wartime regulation of wages and control of rents. So the strike culminated in a mass demonstration of around 100,000 people in George Square, which, like, if you've ever been to George Square, it's hard to imagine that many people there. But 100,000 people in George Square, which ended in a riot, as it was called. With the Russian Revolution having happened relatively recently, the ruling class were on edge, and the Scottish Secretary advised his cabinet colleagues that this was in fact not a strike, but a Bolshevist rising. So they did the proportionate thing by sending in 12,000 troops and 6 tanks, and had machine guns placed at the post office and other buildings. So the 40-hour work week was not granted, and this event was another example of, in the working class's mind, of government repression. And this helped the development of support for the Labour Party, and the anti-socialist middle and upper class shifted towards the Unionist Party that eventually became the Scottish Conservative Party. So in 1922, Labour became the largest party in Scotland and returned 29 MPs, 10 from Glasgow, and they won 32% of the votes cast. So sometimes when people refer to Red Clydeside, they might just be referring to this shift in political allegiances. You have the kind of opening up of the electorate a couple of years before. People can vote for the first time, and Labour comes in and basically takes a lead in Scotland compared to the Liberals who dominated before. Other people would view it as a potentially missed revolutionary moment. Others as just a kind of increased activity on the left wing of the political spectrum, where you have increased trade unionism and other things, but that is harder to see a kind of coherent narrative of like wider organising going on there. It's kind of separate movements that are supporting each other throughout. So there's lots of competing narratives about what Red Clydeside actually is. But I mean, there's a kind of famous picture that you can see of George Square with the red flag raised, and that's kind of come to be associated with it.
It might not be a question for now, but there's something really interesting, right? And this is obviously a matter of huge debate about, you've got all these moments happening in all these countries. Why is it that only in Russia does it kind of become a fully fledged revolution? Because, certainly what you describe in terms of the red flag flying over these huge gathering of people, even if that wasn't a specifically revolutionary movement or whatever, if you were to look at it objectively, it would almost feel like there was more opportunity there than there was in Russia. It's interesting how that, and I'm not expecting us to necessarily come to any conclusions on that today, but it is interesting to think about the idea that actually at that time, objectively, you'd think it's far more likely to see revolution in Scotland than you would in Russia, right?
Well, I mean, I think it was a bit maybe disconnected from the wider trade union movement and what was going on. This was like in Glasgow, and there were definitely people from the surrounding areas. But if you were looking across Scotland, like, there's not the same level of activity. There's not the same that's going on. And I can't remember off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure that I'd read one time that basically this strike had been organized separately from what was supposed to be a wider nationwide strike that was happening for the 40-hour work week. And so John McLean leading that actually kind of made it this separate thing, which made it easier for the government to step in and basically say, nope, this isn't happening. We're going to send all our resources, because I mean, at that point in time, the government would have been significantly weakened militarily after World War I. So it's an interesting moment, and there's definitely questions there. But I think in general, if you're looking at it, there just wasn't enough. And even if there were people who were campaigning for the 40-hour work week, I don't think the majority of people would have been there thinking revolution in mind necessarily. Maybe a couple of people who were committed to that idea at the top, but definitely not in the broader movement from my understanding of events there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think you asked a question about how much we knew about it, and I had to confess my ignorance. And I'm interested to know whether you think that is, that's just my chauvinist English failings, or I guess what I'm asking is how well known are these events in Scotland? How big are they in the kind of Scottish political imaginary, or is this kind of a thing that was huge at the time but has been mostly forgotten or buried in the Scottish imagination?
Well, it depends. In my circle of friends, I mean, everyone would know about it, would talk about it. There had been talk of changing a location near where I used to stay in Glasgow to calling it John Maclean Square, basically, and commemorating that history. I mean, we've got like a statue, which is a commemoration to those who went off and fought against fascism in Spain on the Clyde. So there are elements of working class history all over Glasgow that are celebrated, which is good. But I'd say in the broader imagination, there's not as much. So there's maybe the perception of Scotland being slightly more left wing than the rest of the UK. And in general, like, so for example, when we organized with ANAPO and then we succeeded and everything was in the newspapers, you saw a lot of interactions online of people saying like, of course it would be Glasgow that does this. Which makes sense. And I mean, that shows, I think there is an awareness of the history there, but actually maybe a lack of awareness of the current political situation, that when you look at polling broadly on issues like across the board, you'll see that there's more agreement than we think between Scotland and England. It's just that we also have the Scottish Parliament that's not a first past the post system, that allows for greater representation of the actual political views of the electorate to filter through. So it means that there is that diversity, a greater diversity in our parliament, but that's not necessarily represented across the board south of the border.
Yeah, absolutely not.
I do think there's something as well, Ben, about like you say, oh well, why did this happen? Why is it only Russia that had a successful revolution? And but I'm not sure that's entirely true. Right, because like there were other places that were having revolutions around about the same time, right? So like the Mexican Revolution was happening around the same time, which like, okay, it wasn't like entirely leftist or socialist or communist or whatever, but like it was a strong current. And like there were a bunch of other, I mean, even like the Easter Rising in Ireland, like, okay, they were crushed, but like politically that was kind of the flashpoint of the movement, right? That kind of ultimately led to Ireland, minus the 6 occupied counties, gaining independence. So I think there's more nuance there, I guess, like globally, that we need to acknowledge, because like there was a lot of upheaval. There were a lot of attempts at revolution that were sort of partially successful some of the time.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I guess the point I was trying to drive at was this idea of like where we are now historically. When we look back, we kind of go, right, yeah, obviously Russia is ripe for a revolution, like that is where, but actually at the time there are significant leftist movements all over the shop, right? And actually, that photo you're talking about is quite we will have known people who were alive when that photo was taken. There's probably not many left now, but like it is not that disconnected from our history, and yet it feels like, I guess that kind of that's neoliberalism, right? That the victory of capitalism has felt so complete that we've forgotten those kind of histories, right, that have gone on there.
Yeah, and I think there's also in the churches as well, there's maybe like a bit of a forgetting of some of our past too, and that in becoming so concerned with decline that we've actually forgotten some of the really powerful elements of the church's witness and the past too, and what is done for good in society, and the best parts of our own traditions and what they've done to work for justice, to better people's lives, to make the good parts of the world that we live in today. So whether that is through like the trade unionism in the UK, which had a significant influence from Christianity in the 1800s through the early 1900s, and that has given us so much that we take for granted today.
Thing is, William, I think you might have misjudged the vibe of this podcast, because it's not part of our remit to be positive about Christianity. Like we're
Speak for yourself, Adam. Speak for yourself.
You're the worst one for it.
There's a bit of a tradition of me occasionally saying, "Hey, why don't we just think about some positive stuff?" Or like and Adam just being like, "I don't know how to do that. I don't know what that means. Like, what are you talking about?" Like,
I reject these claims. A, because you are very negative in my humble yet correct opinion, but then also I suppose it is quite hard for me, having been removed from ordination training through no fault of my own, to be positive about the church ever, even though I work for it now, you know.
Yeah, that's fair. That is fair. We will take a little bit of a pause of this conversation. Well, kind of a semi-pause, I guess, because we are going to talk about a saint of the week related to Red Clydeside.
Saint of the week.
Yeah, so Saint of the Week is Helen Crawfurd, who I mentioned a little bit earlier, and of the Women's Peace Crusade. So Helen was the daughter of a baker and trade unionist, and had a religious upbringing, eventually marrying a Church of Scotland minister, although he was 50 years her elder, which is weird, to say the least. But Crawford was eventually drawn to socialist and feminist ideas through encountering the deprivation and inequalities present in Glasgow. And her initial activism as part of the Women's Social and Political Union and wartime activism in the Women's Peace Crusade was rich in the imagery, metaphors, and biblical stories of her religious upbringing and the Scottish Reformed tradition. For example, her Easter appeal in March 1918 was described as an alternative Easter service and offered to do homage to him who came to bring peace on earth and goodwill to men. At another meeting, she drew upon John 10:10 when she stated, "Too long they had looked at Christ in the clouds. By looking and seeing Christ, our fellow man, we would be doing a greater service to humanity." There's also this very famous story, which you can read more about in the work of Leslie Orr, who's done lots of great stuff on Helen Crawford, where she was listening to one of her husband's sermons about Jesus flipping the table and the tables in the temple. And at that moment, she thought to herself, if Christ could be militant, then so can I.
On one level, I'm slightly disappointed we've gone for Helen Crawford, only because I have actually been for quite a while having Helen Crawford in my back pocket as a saint of the week, because she is absolutely fascinating. And you mentioned, is it Leslie Orr? That's the name, isn't it?
Leslie Orr,
who has written a bunch of academic papers about Helen Crawford, which I've read a number of, and are genuinely fascinating. And the only reason we haven't done it for now is genuinely that I was like, every time I went to do it, I was like, I feel like I can't quite do her justice. Like, just an incredible person, and really, you know, one of the ideas of the Saint of the Week is to kind of recover some of that kind of left Christian history that does go missing, and she is such a prime example of this, right? She is central to this kind of distinctly leftist kind of work, whilst also being very deeply Christian about it, right? And actually, it's very clear, as you've kind of said, that her Christianity is her primary motivator for taking up these leftist causes, in a way that is, I think, too often we see people assume that someone's Christianity and their leftism must be in conflict, right? And I don't want to say there's not elements of them rubbing against each other, or I certainly felt that tension at times. But actually, there is a long history of people for whom leftist politics is just the natural outworking of their Christian faith, and that to say there's a tension there wouldn't make sense to them, right? And I think she's a brilliant example of that kind of person.
Yeah, she does eventually abandon her faith. She is an atheist in the end, but yeah, her whole life in activism is deeply shaped by her religious upbringing, by her Christianity that she was raised in, and her husband as well. So it has a massive impact, especially on her wartime activism and things like that too. So yeah, there's so much there to look at.
And you do wonder, this is a hypothetical, it's hard to know, counterfactuals and all that, but does she kind of become an atheist because she just, that's what was going to happen, she changes her mind or whatever? Or does the lack of support from the church, the kind of the way that she's treated in some church circles, kind of cause that, if that makes sense? It's impossible to know, right? But you do wonder whether this is a not unreasonable response to some of her experiences within the church, right?
Well, I mean, there's also this stream of thought in the early 1900s where you begin to see this very religious socialism emerge that maybe is mostly Christians that are espousing it, but that in some way socialism itself becomes a distinct and different religion in a way, which is it's a very gray area. There's a lot of mixed messages that come across in terms of what people are saying. But I mean, you have like the founding of the ILP, the Independent Labour Party. They have a Labour church service that has 5,000 people at it. There's a socialist Sunday school book when you can read the words where by Felix Adler, where from City of the Light, where he says, "All our joys and all our groans help to rear its shining ramparts. All our lives are building stones, but the work that we have builded off with bleeding hands and tears and in error and in anguish will not perish with our years." Like that's, you read that and you're like, yeah, it just sounds like a church hymn, but like it's explicitly, in some ways it's something different. There's this strong sense of immanentism, this idea that God is really truly present in the world and in the material too. So there's all these different streams of thought that are happening at the time that, I mean, I don't know enough about Helen Crawford to say whether or not those had any influence on her, but they're definitely in the air at the time. And you see some people after the war in the church who become kind of disillusioned when they don't call out the fact that the government don't go ahead with the plans for reconstruction, and so they become Labour MPs or they become local activists, or they delve more into the realm of politics, even if they are still clergy. So there's all these interesting crossovers and grey areas at the time.
When I still thought I might be smart enough to do a PhD, my PhD was sort of in this area. So I was looking at the kind of thread of Christian socialism, kind of starting around the kind of early to mid 1800s with people like F.D. Morris, and trying to trace that thread specifically of that form of Christian socialism through to the present day. And it's interesting because, you know, as you sort of allude to there were a lot of different streams of that going on. But what became, I think, the dominant stream, and the one that, you know, we still kind of think about today, was quite a conservative form of Christian socialism. You know, that was the one that ultimately, in a sense, won out. If Christians were going to be socialists, they were going to be this kind of socialist. And to my mind, it wasn't really socialism at all. It was sort of a way to kind of defang socialism, which is not to say that the people who followed it and believed in it and so on didn't really want change, didn't want things to be better, to be improved, but they didn't want socialism. And so it shouldn't really come as a surprise to us that kind of did happen after the war, that after the, you know, when reconstruction wasn't happening, and people kind of became a bit more disillusioned, because even the form of Christian socialism that was the dominant one wasn't really doing a good enough job.
Well, it's quite interesting because you've obviously got organizations that emerged in the 1880s and 90s, like the Guild of St. Matthew, the Christian Socialist Society, and the Christian Social Union. But if you're looking at Scottish church history and within Scottish Presbyterian churches at the time, there was a shift away from the sort of evangelical individualism of the Victorian generation to embrace some new social and political ideas. But I mean, even then, there was less than 100 kind of social progressives holding office in the pre-war Scottish churches. But they were placed in places like colleges and universities and influential urban churches. But I mean, very few of them had read Marxist theory or other secular social theories. And so their socialism was essentially an ethical one. It was based on their extensive practical experience with poverty, which I think is quite interesting because you read some of liberation theology, and a lot of it is really rooted in that practical experience and the embodied experiences of the poor. And I think there's something quite powerful about that ethical socialism that can be drawn out. But yeah, I mean, there's this interesting thread that kind of goes through. So in 1891, the General Assembly appointed a commission to inquire into the religious condition of the people. And they found that social deprivation was often the decisive factor when it came to whether people went to church or not. They concluded that there was a pressing need not only to proclaim the gospel, but for that to be combined with a more equitable distribution of wealth. So one Church of Scotland minister, Reverend A. Scott Matheson, wrote in 1893 that the sin of the church has been to care more for distributing charity than for distributing wealth. So the war presented a moment which for many was supposed to be this turning point. The church would finally take an interest in the concerns of the working class. They might actually begin to address the corporate sins of industrial capitalism and confront social injustice. The General Assembly appointed a special commission on the war in relation to spiritual, moral, and social issues. And so the first report in 1917 argued that the war was both judicial and remedial. So it's judicial in the sense it was an indictment of current society. It was a condemnation of laissez-faire capitalism. And it's remedial in that it offered an opportunity for corporate repentance. And so they said in that report that it is for the church, inspired by the vision of the kingdom of God, to use the occasion provided in the providence of God for the purpose of securing a drastic and permanent amelioration of social conditions. Never again must be her watchword as she contemplates the chaos of pre-war conditions. So this vision aligned with the ideas of reconstruction and government during the war. However, after the war and with the events of the Russian Revolution and Red Clydeside, the government abandoned its plans for social reconstruction, focusing instead on the restoration of pre-war economic conditions. So the church was put in this really difficult position because they've just had all these reports basically condemning the pre-war status quo, and they were also working towards church union between the United Free Church of Scotland and the Church of Scotland. And they needed to have legislation changed to be able to achieve this union. So what do? Do they hold to their reconstructionist vision and risk church union, or do they focus on their predominantly middle-class church membership and the work needed to make union possible? So as early as 1920, you began to see reports on industrial problems, which indicated that it wasn't for the church to advocate for a particular scheme of industrial organization. And so they went ahead with the union. They didn't support the reconstruction and continued to speak up for that. Although there were some within the church who were definitely doing that, but it became a kind of back burner issue. And so the union itself was a massive ecumenical achievement. This was a split that had happened in the Scottish Presbyterian churches kind of back in the 1840s. And so almost a century later, these two massive churches are coming back together. And I have read through the entire basis and plan of union, which is like 200 and something pages long. So that was fun. But yes, it's a massive ecumenical achievement, but it meant that many socially concerned people lost faith in the Presbyterian churches. Some clergy went on to become Labour MPs, like James Barr, for example, of the United Free Church. And the union came into effect at the start of October 1929. And can you remember off the top of your head from standard grade? Well, you wouldn't have done standard grade. What is it like? What would you call it in the English system? I'm just going to say standard grade. From standard grade history, what happened at the end of October 1929? The Wall Street crash. So it happened.
I did about as well as I did any test at school on that one.
We didn't cover it at all. I did GCSE history. We didn't cover it at all.
GCSE, that's the name of it. Yeah. Standard grid was what I went through. So union came into effect start of October 1929, and the Wall Street crash happened a few weeks later. So, I mean, it's obviously that's going to then be the concern of the people, not this newly united church that's there. But new leaders concerned with social issues did eventually emerge in the 30s. So like John Bailey and George MacLeod. But arguably the post-war move away from reconstruction towards union did do damage to the church's social influence at the time. So it was an interesting time. There's a lot going on. There's some good reading that you can do on the topic too that's worth looking at by Professor S.J. Brown. So some good stuff there on reconstructionism and Christian social movements at the time.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting to get that kind of, I guess, bigger picture of what was going on in the church, and actually the way that kind of related in both positive and less positive ways to that Red Clydeside movement, right? I think that's something I guess I was interested in is how does the church relate to that? And I suppose on one level, to say how does the church relate to something is always a bit of a silly question, because as much as we'd like to talk about the church, there is no the church, right? Like there is churches and people in churches and all the rest of it. But what is your read on kind of the relationship, I guess, between churches and Christianity and that Red Clydeside movement specifically?
I mean, I think there's crossover and there's probably support for it at the start anyway, but post-war it seems to be slightly different. There's concern about revolution. There's concern about instability. There's concern about a lot of the social conditions and preserving the social conditions, especially from the ruling class, preserving things the way that they were before the war. So it's it's an interesting relationship, but you see a lot of crossover. And I wouldn't say it was necessarily widespread. It wasn't like every minister, but there was a strong grouping of people that were linked between the two that would be interested in both what was going on in the church and what was going on in the trade union movement, the anti-war movement, things like that at the time too.
Yeah. I wouldn't necessarily expect there to be a kind of institutional level of involvement, but it's interesting that certainly more involvement from individual kind of ministers and the like than perhaps we'd expect to see if something like that happened today, right? That there was maybe more openness to that in that time.
Yeah, I mean, you do see it continue, I suppose, on into the post-World War II as well. So there's some really interesting movements in Scotland and groupings. I mean, the Iona community in its early days is very radical and continued on in the 60s and 70s to be relatively radical too. You had the Gorbals group, which was partly inspired by like the East Harlem Protestant parish, the worker priest movement and things too. Then you had the Church's House, which was an ecumenical initiative, but was this amazing space for like arts and culture and politics discussions to happen. There was tons that went on like post World War II as well, and a lot of that seems to have fizzled out. Especially the ecumenical stuff in the late 70s, early 80s, you begin to see that. which I think coincides with a lot of the decline of other institutions as well, like trade unions, for example, community organizations, the rise of neoliberalism.
I was going to say, I know it's a cliche to blame neoliberalism for everything, but sometimes it is.
Yeah, there's definitely seems to be that organizing spirit that's present in the 60s too. Like the period of time that I'm looking at, there's so much that's going on at the time in Scotland of the 1960s. So and it's in some ways it's maybe a bit more mature and thought through. There's some really interesting reports in the General Assembly. Like they've got, at that point, they have a report every year on industrial issues, and so they'll talk about industrial chaplains. So they have chaplains in workplaces for trade unions and things too. There was a meeting by one presbytery, and you read it, and it's basically advocating that Christians should be as involved as possible in their trade unions, and they should sign up to be shop stewards. So
amen, amen, and amen.
There's stuff like that in the 60s. There's a report that's on the basically, I think it's 1 or 2 years worth of reports where they talk about the idea of just revolution. So it basically says, like, if we have just war theory, we're seeing all these different revolutions and uprisings around the world. Can we envisage the possibility of a just revolution? So there's lots of interesting stuff within that. You also see the reports from the Church of Scotland in I think it's the late 50s on like communism and things too, where they're talking about it, and it's very much a case of from reading that report anyway, it's very much a case of like, Christ is Lord. We don't submit to any political ideology. There's some things that we can learn from it, other things that we should reject. So, I mean, there's a great stuff that's going on at the time, and the institution itself seems to be trying to engage with some of these things, even if in some cases it's unsuccessful or does it poorly. Like the Social and Moral Welfare Committee, when you look at some of their reports at the time, it's not great, but it's, especially the ones on things like homosexuality and women in society, where it talks about some of the ills of society being the fault of the promiscuous women and things like that. It's there's good and there's bad that's going on at the time.
Isn't there always?
Yeah, exactly. But I think today, now that the wave of secularism has well and truly hit the churches, and they're realizing, oh, wait a minute, we're losing membership and we should do something about it. There's so much else to be thinking about and looking at, that I think that people maybe are have less energy or space to begin to do this type of organizing. But which is why I always say it'd be great if ministers got a course in trade union organizing or community organizing skills, because actually those are really valuable for church work too.
I don't know if I've said this on the podcast before. I probably have.
There's nothing we haven't said on this podcast at this point.
Yeah. But I just, obviously I spent 2 years training, and okay, look, I was training for ministry in the Church of England. So, it's not exactly going to be the most radical institution in the world. But one of the things that I found incredible, especially considering I went to, a college that is widely considered to be the most radical training institution, it was just the lack of engagement with that kind of thing, actually. And the kind of normative assumptions around things like, the one that really stuck out to me was rent seeking. So like we had a session where it was like a bridging into ministry kind of session for a couple of hours, and one of the things that the lecturer said was, if you own a house, you might want to think about keeping hold of that house and renting it out, because then you'll have some extra income coming in, and you can retire there if you want to. Because, of course, for anyone who's listening who doesn't know this, certainly in the Church of England and probably most other churches where you're paid minister, that role comes with a house. right? It's not yours to keep, but it's yours to live in whilst you're doing that role. And I remember being absolutely stunned that people that was completely normal for people. Nobody challenged it. Nobody said maybe we should think about the morality of rent seeking, of renting out houses. It just didn't compute, it didn't even enter their imagination that there might be a problem with that. And so I think you're probably right. I think it would be good if ministers and so on that were in training did have that kind of course. But I think there's so much groundwork to be done before you even think about that as well. Maybe that's part of the groundwork, but it just, I don't know. This is where I'm kind of doing that negative thing about the church again. Sorry, everyone.
And you denied it was the case earlier.
Yeah, what can you do?
But I think it is interesting to think about actually what do we train ministers to do, and without making it sound for a moment like ministers don't do loads of work, because they absolutely do. But there is an element of some level of freedom in the role to kind of shape how you want that social engagement side of things to be. But at the same time, what I think about the local vicar where I am, and essentially they are part of their role is that they are a asylum worker, right? Like that is how, like, because we have quite a lot of refugees in the church and all the rest of it. And I've worked in asylum, and I got quite a lot of training around the asylum system, around cultural sensitivity, and it was really valuable to help me work with asylum-seeking kids. And on top of that, I had various qualifications, training experience in all the stuff that you'd expect, given that I was working in a children's social care setting, right? And yet, I think the priest doing it is absolutely brilliant, right? But he doesn't have any of that. Like he's never actually been trained to work in asylum. He has just ended up in a context where that is what being a minister looks like, right? And I think that's actually, what are we training people up to do? Because actually, ministers these days, they're closer to social workers than anything else a lot of the time, right? And actually, what is the what is the useful stuff? And potentially community organising, trade union organising are really valuable skills that aren't kind of the default for most ministers.
Yeah, well, one of my favourite parts of my summer placement last year was that I got to spend a day a week at Glasgow City Mission, which they just provide so many incredible services. So they have like a daily drop-in where people can come in for lunch or for dinner. They can come in as often or as little as they like. And then they also provide a thing called Urban, which is like a drop-in where they do like art classes, music classes. They've got a gym and showers, and they'll give you like breakfast and tea and coffee. And so when I was there, you'd often just be sitting down with people, helping them fill in applications for English language courses or for a college course that they want to be able to do. And there's computers there that they can use too. And there are English language classes in the place. There's so many other ones that they do. There's a services for addicts and former addicts. And you just got to meet so many incredible people. And I think one of my favorite moments was getting to do like a Lectio Divina with this group of former addicts. And it was just so meaningful for me. But actually just getting that experience that was totally different from being in a parish setting was so worthwhile.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something about that, isn't there, about what does the kingdom of God look like? Does it look like nice, well-dressed, middle-class people trotting along on a Sunday morning to a service? Like, to some extent, I don't want to exclude that completely, but actually there's something about, being in communities of people that have experience of the sharp end of life, and being there with them and walking alongside in kind of solidarity with them, that is, I don't know, incredibly valuable, and not always seen as the most glamorous roles, I guess, but are
the dark godless society of communism.
Thank you for that contribution, Adam, as always. One day I'm going to turn that soundboard off you.
Good luck.
Over your cold, dead body, is that right?
Exactly.
I think that is probably just about what we have time to discuss, unless anyone has any last bit of thing they want to throw in. No, we could probably spend the next 3 hours discussing this and more. Obviously it is a fascinating bit of history, and it's really helpful to kind of, I guess, fill in the gaps. I'm sure there are several other English chauvinists like myself listening to this going, I never knew about that kind of history of Glasgow and all that stuff. And I think it's really, really fascinating to fill that in.
It's been great chatting to you. If people want to read maybe a bit more about, obviously you've mentioned Shibboleth already, about the experience of unionising, but I've also got a chapter in the book Awake, Emerging and Connected, published by SCM Press, if people want to read that, edited by Victoria Turner, Dr. Victoria Turner. So there's some excellent chapters in there. One's on Palestinian women, Hindu liberation theology, queer Presbyterians. There's great chapters in there. Highly recommend the book if you've not read it already.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And if people want to kind of keep up with what you're doing and what's going on, William, where and else can they find you?
Mostly you'll find me on Instagram and TikTok by the same username, which is just at William Gibson GLA.
Can definitely vouch for William's TikTok as well. Lots of really good, positive Christian stuff going on there, so everyone should go and follow him there.
And I see them on Instagram and also appreciate them there, but TikTok makes me feel like an old man whenever I go on it, so this is not... Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. Adam, where in the world can people find you?
Well, TikTok. Probably shouldn't be on TikTok as someone who is heading towards 40 much more quickly than I feel comfortable with. But TikTok, Instagram probably as well.
And your handle is?
Oh, yeah, at CommieXIAN.
Very professional as always. Need to remind you about the handle. The thing about TikTok is it's the same with Instagram Reels for me. Like it's too much is happening. It makes my brain hurt. Like, I
think what you'll find, Ben, is that Instagram Reels is the same as TikTok.
Yeah.
I find it weird that Instagram is no longer just like a photo sharing app.
It is how I use it. I can't deal with it. It just hurts my brain too much, and it makes me feel very old.
Of the two of us, I feel like you're definitely older in spirit than I am.
I'm going to take that as a compliment, although I don't think it was meant as one. Thank you very much, William, for joining us. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. If you want to get in touch with us, we're at breadandrosaries.com. All our contact details on there. So do get a hold of us, do that. We are on YouTube, so you can see our lovely faces if that is what floats your boat. I'm not a YouTube podcast person, but apparently this is the new world that we live in. So please do subscribe to us on there, and everything else is on breadandrosaries.com. Do get in contact with us. We love hearing from people. Thank you very much for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
See you later.